Hey everyone, we're doing something a little different today. Mark Rosewater has posted a nuts and bolts article about play boosters. He gets into the weeds about how play boosters are structured and about how design philosophy is going to be approaching play boosters going forward. This has some big implications, not just for limited play, but also for Magic in general. And I feel like we need to discuss what's going on here. So first of all, just to be clear, he's writing this article from the perspective of a game designer. So he's not specifically trying to talk about limited, but there's going to be a lot of talk about it because it has to do with the structure of a booster pack. So play boosters have shifted 10 commons over to uncommons. So instead of having 101 commons and 80 uncommons, it's going to have 81 commons and 100 uncommons. This article does not explicitly state why. But if I had to hazard a guess, the reason for the shift to having more uncommons, aside from wanting to include 10 additional two-color pair cards that act as like signpost cards for two-color pairs in limited. Aside from that, I would guess the other reason for the change is just that there are fewer commons in the packs. And if there are just not as many common cards in the pack, uncommons have to do more of their heavy lifting. They have to share more of the burden of what common cards used to do in draft. He says a play booster is guaranteed to have one rare or mythic, but can have as many as 4. And actually, if you go and look at the Amazon fine print for the Outlaws at Thunder Junction play booster product, that one says that there are 1 to 5 rares or mythics in each pack. So I guess this is going to have room to go up. He says having less commons means less overall cards, both in creatures and non-creatures. He's going over color by color here. The reason for this is that the drop in common cards means we have no room for unplayable commons. Unplayable common is defined as a card that situationally might be unplayable in a sealed deck. It's too narrow in what it does. He uses the example of naturalize or disenchant that only blow up artifacts and enchantments. So in best of 3, you might sideboard it in. He says we're doing 3 things to get rid of unplayable commons. 1, the average power level will be higher. Set more for limited play than constructed. If you're playing a color, most monocolor creatures in that color will at least be playable in your deck. Some creatures may be more synergistic with certain draft themes, but the base creature stats will usually be something you can run. 2, we're moving some effects from common to uncommon. An example is temporary stealing cards like Threaten that we normally do at common in red. 3, will make more use of modal effects. We can still do a naturalize or disenchant at common, but it will be paired with another effect that is more useful. Point number 2, I guess this means they're going to move some of the bad cards to uncommon. Point number 3, will have more modal spells, which that will increase their functionality. It'll make them better in a wider range of cases. It's also going to increase the complexity on the cards. But point number 1 here, if you're playing a color, most monocolor creatures in that color will at least be playable in your deck. So how important is that, really? Has there been a set in recent memory where anyone can recall lacking for enough playables when you were playing limited? And is that a good thing? He says the other major reason a card might be unplayable is power level. And this is a problematic statement. I will explain why using Mark Rosewater's own words. So, this is another Mark Rosewater article, When Cards Go Bad Revisited. We're also going to reference the original When Cards Go Bad. Talking about why bad cards need to exist in Magic the Gathering. Design principle number 1. Games are supposed to challenge the player. In every set, we purposefully include cards that we know are much better than they appear, just as we make cards that are worse than first impression. In order to do this, we need to have a wide range of cards exist, because it's hard to have good cards that seem bad without having some bad cards that are bad. But wait, wouldn't having a world where every card is good make the process even harder? If every card was playable, wouldn't that create a lot more decisions? Actually, no, it wouldn't. Why? Well, I'm glad you asked. You see, in early design, we go out of our way to purposefully make a flat power curve. We do this because the goal of early design isn't about a balanced environment, but rather about getting all the cards played so the design team can figure out where the fun is. As such, I have a lot of experience building from sets with flat power levels. Why isn't it harder to build? Because you can't go that wrong. If every card is playable, then almost any combination of cards will work. Would a top-level Pro Tour caliber player have a harder time? Absolutely. When you're good enough to see minute differences or understand synergy issues, yes, there are plenty of decisions to be made. But that is a teeny tiny portion of the audience. Even then, though, my deck is going to be a lot closer in power level to John Finkel's deck than in a normal environment. John Finkel's a Pro Tour Magic player, in case you're not aware. In Mark Rosewater's own words, a format where every card is playable is not more interesting for deck building. It's not more interesting for drafting. It's not harder to build unless you are in the tiny portion of the audience who's of a Pro Tour caliber level. And it means that you're not as rewarded for good play, you're not as punished for bad play. So you might be asking, well, okay, but what's wrong with that? Good players will still probably win a little bit more. So what's the problem if the bad players get to put together a good deck? This is from his original article, When Good Cards Go Bad. Point number 3. Diversity of card powers is key to discovery. Here's the problem. Imagine cards' relative difficulty as a slope. Any card below your comprehension level on the slope, meaning that you already understand it, right, at your current level of Magic experience, is either obviously playable or obviously bad. And the rest requires some thought or gameplay to categorize. But we have to design Magic for all players. That means the more advanced a player you are, the more cards you label as bad cards. But the lower level cards are crucial to allowing the beginning player the same sense of discovery and exploration. You may think that the Lucky Charms, that's this cycle of artifacts, where when you play a spell of a certain color, you can pay 1 colorless. If you do, you gain 1 life. There's 1 for each of the colors. You may think they're bad, but our testing shows that most beginners are drawn to them and only learn over time that they are not as good as they seem, usually because a more advanced player tells them. This is why we keep including them in the basic set, meaning the core set. There are 2 responses I expect to my reasoning. First, Magic is an advanced game. R&D's first level is too low. Magic players are a smart crowd, they can figure it out. And he says that they've spent a great deal of time and money to understand the player base. We make cards for the first level of difficulty because many players exist at that level. Remember that the average Magic player is 13 years old. I don't know if that's still true, but Magic, yeah, they try to get you in the door when you're still like a teenager or whatever. The future health of the game rests on there being a good entry point for beginners. If new players stop joining, there will be no Magic for the advanced players to play. So, here's one of the first problems we run into when there are no bad cards, or a greatly reduced amount of bad cards. New players experience less discovery. When there's more of a flat power level across all cards, it's not as easy for a new player to tell which ones are the good cards and which ones are the bad cards. There's a lot of nuance and a lot of gray area when there's a flat level of power. We've been to Ravnica maybe one too many times, but the first time around, Ravnica City of Guilds, it ended up being one of the most popular sets of all time and one of the most popular settings of all time. And in that set of cards is this card, Zephyr Spirit. Let's pay attention to it for a second. This costs 1 blue and 5 mana. It's a common. It's a creature spirit. It's a 0/6 for 6 mana. When Zephyr Spirit blocks, return it to its owner's hand. This card is bad. If you were making a top 50 list of the worst Magic cards ever made, I think Zephyr Spirit stands a very good chance of making it into the top 50. Maybe even the top 25. Now, that is not to say that this card is useless, though. Right? Let's say you are a new player who's just starting to learn Magic, and you're not sure what's valuable, right? You're not sure whether you should be trying to win the game or protect yourself. So you look at this card, you see that it has 6 toughness, it's very hard to kill, and you see that when it blocks, it returns back to your hand. Now initially, you're thinking about the card, you say, okay, well, I don't want to have to cast it again every turn, but then they think, wait, that means I can block with this every single turn and it will stop my opponent's biggest creature. And this Zephyr Spirit will never die. I can play it every turn for the rest of the game and block their biggest thing. I have a chump blocker for the rest of the game, and that's true. The card could have some other weird niche case things that it does for you, like triggering an enters the battlefield effect whenever you play a creature. Something like that. So it's not that the card does nothing. And a new player might think that this is a useful defensive piece when they're looking at the set, not realizing that they should be prioritizing cards that can win the game for them, and not trying to defend themselves with a card that's going to cost them 6 mana every turn for the rest of the game. So, pretty early on in your Magic career, you can probably discern that this is a bad card, but maybe not right away. Maybe not the first time you read it. Maybe someone explains it to you. And then the light bulb clicks on, and you figure out why this isn't so good. A lot of people out there may have forgotten that they had to learn these fundamental things when they were first being taught the game. But it's just as true today as it was back in Ravnica City of Guilds. This bad card being in the set was a way for new players to discover what a bad card is. To discover power level, to discover how to write cards for limited play. And this atrociously bad card comes from one of the most beloved sets of all time. Design principle number 5, this is from his second article. Make the players love something. It says, if you make a game that everyone likes but no one loves, it will fail. Now, the point he was trying to make here is that they have to make a lot of very niche cards to appeal to a broad swath of players across different formats, who play for different reasons, who like different things. That was the point that he was trying to make. But I would also say that if you make a very flat power level, where everything is kind of fine and playable, but nothing pokes its head out, nothing seems especially good or especially bad, that's going to not elicit a very emotional response from players. The bad cards, elicit a visceral reaction of, oh, that card's terrible, why would anyone make that? And by contrast, a really good card, you can tell is good because the bad cards exist. If this card's over here being a 3/5 for 5 with no abilities, and this one over here is a 5/5 with vigilance that draws you a card when it enters the battlefield, you say, wow, this card is so amazing, and the reason it's so amazing is because it's better than that other card. If all of the cards are safe and homogenized, I worry that the set is going to be lukewarm, mediocre in its reception. So here in his second article, he addresses the point about the audience again, about discovery, saying don't overestimate your audience. It says, many years ago we did a survey where we asked the players to rank their own play skill. We gave the following 5 choices: significantly below average, average, above average, and significantly above average. 80% of the respondents chose either D or E, but most chose D. What does that say? It says that a lot of Magic players overestimate their own skill. And mathematically speaking, that just has to be true. If 80% of players claim that they are above average or more, then that doesn't leave any room for there to be an average. He says a similar phenomenon happens with game designers. We tend to overestimate the skill set of our players. We're so invested in the nooks and crannies that we sometimes forget that many players don't think about the game at the level we think about it. We know at any one time there are thousands upon thousands of new players in Magic, and we're not even talking about casual players. In short, as game designers, we have to drill our learning lessons very deep. Bad cards that might be obvious to a more advanced player might take months or even years for some less experienced players to figure out. And it's crucial that we provide the discovery process for every player, not just the top tier ones. It's another important job of bad cards, making sure everyone, no matter how inexperienced, has something to learn. And remember, every set needs to have a card or two that even the most inexperienced player can recognize as bad. Now, if we're not going to be having Zephyr Spirits running around in modern Magic sets with the play boosters, some other card has to serve this role of discovery for new players. Are they going to print terrible uncommons to fill this role? Or are they going to save the job of bad cards that teach new players things about the game for the rares and mythics? I'm not asking this to be snide, I'm asking this in all seriousness. If the commons all have to be good, do all of the bad cards have to exist at uncommon, rare, and mythic, so new players can figure out a good card from a bad card, to have obvious examples, like the Zephyr Spirit? Because if there are no obvious examples, if everything's made on a flat, static, bland power curve, not a curve at all, just kind of a flat line, then new players have nothing to compare those cards to, and everything looks about equally playable to everything else. From his original article, point 5, diversity of power rewards the more skilled player. So, he wants to point out that bad cards have some good effects on the game. I think the best reason to have a diversity of card power is it increases the skill in the game. A lesser player is more likely to draft a suboptimal card. A more novice player will put questionable spells into his decks. Both occurrences increase the chances the better player will win. As an example, let's assume R&D made a set where every card was exactly the same power level. Actually impossible, but for the sake of this argument, let's assume we could do it. Player A and Player B are both drafting in the same 8-person booster draft. Player A is a professional. Player B has only been playing for 4 months. In this scenario, Player A has much less of an advantage than normal. No matter what cards Player B drafts, they're still good. Player B's deck might not have synergy, and the mana base will probably be a little off, but he's going to be drawing nothing but solid cards. Magic has randomness built into its design. The decks are shuffled, after all. Diversity of power helps tilt the odds back towards skill. A more flat, homogenized power level is going to be less skill testing, because it's more likely that someone could just cobble together a deck and could randomly pull out a win more often, just because all of the cards are at a flat power level and their deck's going to be good. I don't know if that's what people want out of their draft formats. Personally, I like to invest in my skill and my ability to evaluate cards and try to build the best draft deck that I can. And I would add to this that not only do all cards being playable make things less skill intensive, but it also causes a bit of fatigue when you're drafting a set. If every card is potentially playable, then you have to agonize over the nuances between this 3/2 for 3, this 2/3 for 3, this 2/2 flyer for 3. Once the cards are a little bit too close in power level, it starts taking up more and more space in your brain because you have to keep them all in mind when you're picking a card for your deck, if you really want to be paying attention and be good at the draft format. There are fewer cards that you can easily write off. Maybe that's not a problem, but I thought I would mention it. From the second article, Design Principle 4, force players to improvise. Another truism of game design is that you can't give the players everything they need. Games at their core are about allowing players to challenge themselves. How do bad cards play into this? Another way to challenge players is to make them play with cards that aren't very good. One of the most skill-testing things you can do, for example, is not give the players enough cards in a draft and force them to play with cards below the line of what they would normally play. He says, I ran a lot of formats at the Magic Invitational where I challenged the best players in the world by making them have to evaluate things they had learned to ignore. And this is true. If you haven't played in an old draft format before, it's kind of a foreign concept in modern Magic. But it used to be that one of the difficulties of drafting an old set is if you couldn't find your lane, if you couldn't find the open colors, you could end up starting to lack enough playables, is the way they would put it. And you'd have to start running some genuinely bad cards in your deck in order to fill out enough slots. You know, maybe you run 18 lands to try to increase the mana consistency of the deck because you don't have enough spells. Maybe you start playing some things that you know are bad, but you need more blockers, you need more things to do in the game, so you run the card anyway. It was a fun challenge, and it's something that's just very lost with modern sets now. It seems like all the time I'm just cutting what feels like 5 to 15 playable cards when I do a draft, because everything's pretty good now, and apparently it's just going to be more so in the future. I think I've belabored my point long enough there. So let me just say that trying to get rid of unplayable commons is a notion that I have problems with. People are going to take this news as if, they said they've put chocolate milk in the drinking fountains or whatever, but I'm concerned that it's going to make everything less interesting. It's going to make it less of a good learning experience for new players. And they're going to have to shunt off more of those bad cards to the uncommons, rares, and mythics. Another point I wanted to address from the Nuts and Bolts article about play boosters is about mana fixing. So it says another side effect of play boosters is that we have to be extra careful with how easy we give green access to other colors in Limited, as it's much easier to just play a good stuff deck, a deck with all the best spells in each color, with all the powerful rares and mythic rares. This means we are more likely to do land fetching that gets lands off the top cards of your library, rather than fetching one out of your deck. We will also be more careful with lower rarity mana acceleration spells, to have green cards give you access to green mana rather than any color. This will still help you ramp without making it easier to splash other colors. So for this one, I've got a personal anecdote. I really enjoy March of the Machine Limited. I thought that was an incredibly fun format. If you get a chance to play a quick draft on MTG Arena of March of the Machine, it's a blast. There are so many extra rares and uncommons and things floating around. There was even for a little while a format where they replaced one of the commons in the pack with an Aftermath card, so there could be just an absurd number of weird rares and mythics in those packs. The mana fixing in March of the Machine was good. And so you could, play a 3-color deck, or even, more than that, as long as you could figure out what the synergies were across the different 2-color pairs. And that was a neat game in and of itself. Something I learned along the way was that the cards that make the incubator tokens could help cross-pollinate with different synergies across the different archetypes. +1 counters for green-white, Phyrexians for white-black, Transform for green-blue, just on and on. That format was fun and ridiculous, over the top. It felt like everyone had access to just a wild power level of deck, and all kinds of things were possible. Sky was the limit. I don't know that having good mana fixing was necessarily a problem for that format. I understand that maybe not everyone likes that in a limited format, but it was very enjoyable. A lot of limited formats in the distant past actually had trouble cobbling together anything more than a 2-color deck because they didn't have enough mana fixing in them. I know that's going back a long time in order to find formats where that was true. Things mostly prior to Ravnica City of Guilds, I would say. But in those formats, you had to make do more with monocolored cards. Generally, you would have to go into 2 colors. It's very hard to find enough playables in just 1 color in Limited and be a competitive deck. So generally, you would end up into 2 colors because it was a necessity. Even though there wasn't good mana fixing, you could kind of get away with 2 colors. And you would only splash in more if you had an extremely powerful card. It was a very slow format, or you just didn't have enough playables and you had to do so. Did that feel better, not having access to color fixing in those formats? I would say that modern sets with more mana fixing feel better. than those old sets do. It can be very tricky to cobble together a good playable limited deck in some of those old formats with not enough color fixing. Um, so taking some color fixing off the table, I'm going to argue here, is actually removing some of what players enjoyed about set boosters with the multiple rares and things. That was one of the fun parts of March of the Machine draft, because that was a draft with, a lot of rares, a high-powered format. But they're talking about having a format like this where you could open 2 to 5 rares in a play booster. He says 4 in the article, but Outlaws of Thunder Junction says in the fine print that it can have up to 5 rares per pack. They're giving you a format where you can open up to 5 rares, but now they don't want you to play with them. They want to increase the number of colored pips on those rares to where now you open all these rares, but no, don't take those. That's being an unreasonable drafter. No, you have to take these good cards we've seeded for you at common. You need to ignore this rare that you can't splash because it's got 2 white pips and 2 blue pips. So maybe that means that the blue-white player at your table randomly gets an amazing mythic rare because no one else can play it. But maybe once in a while it means that no one at your table is in blue-white. That 2-color combination's just not in your draft pot. No one's actually in that color combination. And that mythic rare ends up just going late, and someone ends up rare drafting it towards the tail end of the pack. Was that a better outcome? I don't know. Why give us all of these rares and mythics in the boosters if it's going to be hard to cast them? At that point, it feels like you've made some strange exchange where the set is fighting against itself. Like the play booster is fighting its reason for existing in the first place. I could be wrong. We'll have to see how it plays out. There's going to be an extra 10 2-color archetype signpost cards at uncommon. So there's going to be an additional 10 multicolor cards in the pack. And we just saw in green that there's going to be less color fixing. Now, it doesn't matter as much with the splashy rares and whatever. It's like, okay, maybe you didn't want someone to get a crazy bomb that's going to just take over the game. So you make it cost 4 different colored pips of mana or whatnot. And, okay, now that card is safe. But what about these uncommon cards? Now we've significantly upped the percentage of cards that maybe no deck can play. Maybe no one is in those colors. If there's a person who happens to be in that lane, drafting that color pair, that's great for them. They're going to pick it up sometime late in the pack, probably. If no one is in that 2-color pair, there are more dead cards going around the pack because people can't splash them because there's going to be less color fixing. Again, is this a good thing? I don't know. So they're adding more removal to all the colors, and they're even adding a dedicated removal slot to colorless, which is interesting to me. It's kind of taking the place of the equipment slot. I'm not saying there will never be common equipment, but and they're saying that the reason they've added all this extra removal across all the common cards is to help fight off the new influx of rares and mythics. So again, this is trying to fix a problem that they introduced themselves. Is that going to play better? No idea. Another odd thing that they've done is there aren't necessarily going to be any 1-mana cards, 1-mana creatures, I should say, in any of the colors. It's some of the colors don't have a 1-mana creature slot, some of the colors, it's a coin flip. It could be a 2-mana card, it could be a 1-mana card. And I guess this is to slow the format down. If they were having trouble with a fast format in the first place, I feel like there are other ways to do that. You know, they mentioned earlier in the article around blue that they had to be careful about high toughness creatures because they slow the format down. But again, this is like you're trying to fix a problem you've created yourself, where they don't want high toughness creatures, but now we're getting rid of 1-mana creatures. Because we need the format to be slower. It feels like you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. I know I don't always have the most popular opinions, and I know a lot of people are probably going to appreciate the changes that Mark Rosewater has unveiled about play boosters, but I have concerns about the long-term health of the game and the overall effect it's going to have. I'm concerned it's going to make sets more boring. I'm concerned it's going to be a more difficult experience for not just new players in terms of having more trouble learning the game because they don't have a basis of comparison, but also potentially a harder game for experienced players because if every card's playable, then you have to analyze all of them. I'm worried it could lead to more mediocrity and fewer things that are both delightfully good and delightfully bad. What do you think? Sound off in the comments. Anyway, if you've had any entertainment from me today, then you could like, subscribe, checking out my other videos helps a lot. And until next time, never stop honing your critical thinking and empathy.